Hello and welcome to Editor's Pick, a War Elephant podcast, episode 16. I have with me my normal co-host Christine,
Hello.
and I also have one of our longtime contributors, Winston. He's part of our editorial and moderation staff.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Winston, tell us a little bit about how you joined War Elephant and what it is you're interested in.
Well, I think like most of us, I joined War Elephant via Quora, so via the group, and ever since then I've been hanging around the Discord, occasionally posting rants, thoughts, analysis, mostly the first. And a lot of my interests are somewhere generally in the area of national security or technology, or generally politics in general, being just the group that we are. And occasionally I also find articles or write things that get shared within War Elephant or outside.
You've been very helpful, especially in the areas of foreign policy and in economics.
Glad to hear that.
I would add academics. We've had really good conversations about that on the server, which a link to join is in the description of this podcast and should be in the show notes if you're listening by audio. So do join.
And a lot of these, I would say, have the general, share the general theme of, these are all areas where power is rooted in society. And, we, as people on the right who are concerned about the concentration of power, we don't want to, concentrate power for ourselves. We wanted to divide it among as many people as possible, so everybody can have a share of it, so nobody can wield it tyrannically over others. However, all of these are similar because, as it be a government or, for that matter, tech or academia, all of these are about how power can be concentrated and then wielded against others and used to impose upon others. And of course, in these times, this is an area of primary concern for all of us, but especially those of us on the right.
Well, something that Winston's sort of getting into is why I wanted to have him on the podcast. We had a conversation, I would say, how old is this?
Must be about a year ago now. I think
it was a long time ago. The document I have that we created together is from 2019. And Winston and I were talking talking on the Discord about the issues of the power of the state. And we sort of booted around the idea of calling this episode the Leviathan, based on
Hobbes's
Thomas
Leviathan.
Hobbes's, Leviathan, which is a theory of the state very much rooted in the idea that order and
that the
power
outside world is like a jungle. The world is jungle, and if you're in the jungle, you'll be eaten, and therefore you create a Leviathan to protect you from the other Leviathans so you don't get eaten. And so, the thing with Thomas Hobbes's, conception of the Leviathan is that it's very authoritarian. It's he lived during the time in England when he was a proponent of the absolute monarchy, and he was saying, so we have this absolute monarchy, and I know we step on you a lot, but we do it because we need to protect you from the bad things. And the bad things in England at this time were like the Catholic Church or France or generally some combination of those two. So it's this is not something that Americans should would normally regard with some kind of horror, and that's how the founders would have regarded Leviathan. It's like this is an argument for dictatorship. This is what the English monarchy used to justify keeping Americans under the boot in the first place. Why are we even arguing for this thing? But the problem is that Thomas Hobbes wasn't wrong. Had got one thing right, which is that it is a dangerous world. It's full of these people who have malicious intentions, even if they don't think about it that way. But that is what it is. Is who want to collect power themselves and then use it to impose on others. And so let's say right now in this particular time, one of the most powerful countries in the world is China, and their dictatorship. And a lot of the political ideology behind China is that actually this dictatorship thing is pretty great. It's a very Hobbesian way of viewing the world. And in order to make ourselves safe, we need to impose on you, so you can't impose on us. So it's very Hobbesian, so by forming their own Leviathan, they're able to impose on others. And surely, I imagine that they would think that they're doing it for their own good. But in the end, this is to the bad of everybody else who is going to be the recipient of the imposition. So, but then this brings us to where Thomas Hobbes originally brought up Leviathan. We are creating this Leviathan in order to protect us from their Leviathan, and then each Leviathan gets a little stronger, and then the other Leviathan gets stronger, and you find that you're creating your own monster that can be turned on you yourself and to eat yourself. So it's sort of like, so that's kind of what Leviathan, what the discussion I had with Ian about Leviathan comes from. How can we balance these two trade-offs of security against the other people's Leviathan, especially the dictatorships that are going to make things work for us, with the fact that we're creating a monster that it's going to come back and eventually eat us. And that's ties us back to the relationship between people on the right like us and the state. Hey Jim. So most of us are on the right. Most of us generally have a pretty antagonistic relationship with the state. The state is the source of a lot of these terrible ideas that mostly make our lives worse. First, you have these things like just to go back to the previous year alone, the state imposes all these regulations on how you can create medicines and how fast you can distribute them. And we found out that a lot of this is probably kind of overrated because we swept it aside so fast once we realized there was a scenario where we've had to get it out as soon as possible. So the state has this, so we don't really have a good relationship with the state. We don't really think highly of the things they do and who. But at the same time, the fact is that when we're faced with external threats, not only in the now, but also in the past, such as in the founding of America, there was the external threat from Britain. Then there was the external threat from Britain again in the War of 1812. Then the Civil War against, well, that was more of an internal threat, but then there were the World Wars. And every single one of these events led to a massive increase in the power of the state. For example, the permanent army came from the War of 1812 because they realized, wow, we can't just raise the militia every time a foreign power comes knocking, because the militia isn't very even well trained at all. It's a part-time army, and it didn't do very well against the full-time army of Britain. Then the World Wars came around, and that brought us to a military-industrial complex. And then now there's just permanent. I don't really like the term deep state, but deep state, which is just exists permanently to protect us ostensibly from the Soviet Union or the Nazis. And now we've created our own Leviathan to protect us from the external threats. And this is something that, in the grand scheme of things, as conservatives concerned about concentration of power, we should be concerned about. But then why are we? But end of it, so now we realize that we need these things in order to protect us from the outside powers, and now we need to figure out how we can balance this with liberty, because that is what liberty is: the freedom to not be imposed upon by these concentrations of power that we've created for ourselves. And that, in short, is the theory of the Leviathan. I mean, this is more of a jumping off point. So, do we prioritize the security aspect, because it's so relevant right now, because we're moving back into the Cold War 2.0 with China, because as we need to protect the American way of life from dictatorship. And so, how much power do we want to give the state in order so they can prosecute the Cold War with China? Do we want to give a lot? Can we be sure that this won't be used to turn around and backfire on us? After all, some of the tools that we're going to use to prosecute a new Cold War, like foreign intelligence, counterintelligence, has backfired. That was a very big controversy with Russiagate. Could you be assured that the tools that are being used to protect Americans from China aren't going to be used to persecute Americans in Russiagate 2.0? So those are the big questions that underlie the Leviathan discussion that I believe we're all here to discuss now.
Yeah. Why don't we break that down a little bit into a couple of objections that I would foresee. Now, I am pretty much on board myself with what you say, but a lot of people on the right are very much in an isolationist attitude or mode these days. And they will say that we have spent the last 60 to 70 years playing World Cup with very little to show for it. As I said, I don't hold this opinion, but I would be interested to hear what you think in terms of the question of, without global support, what is the incentive for the United States to continue in their attempts to maintain a liberal order against a world that doesn't want it?
So there's two things answers that I would give this question. So firstly, regarding the World Cup criticism, it is completely, absolutely, objectively, 100% correct. World Cup has been an absolute disaster for Americans, and so I know this isn't not something that you agree with, but in terms of the amount of blood and treasure spent in Iraq, and that's just the most recent example, it's just it would be very hard to justify having spent over $1 trillion and thousands of American lives and tens of thousands of Iraqi lives in pursuit of building democracy in Iraq. Because even if you accepted the basic premise that building democracy in Iraq was a worthwhile pursuit of American policy goal to pursue, it's very hard to justify that relative to the cost that America paid to try to do this, and not only paid to pursue it, but paid unsuccessfully to pursue it. And when conservatives say we want to pull back, we don't want to spend blood and not just conservatives, but also many people on the left as well say that we want to pull back. We want to waste money on these kinds of pointless aventurism anymore. Well, they're not wrong. Most people, it would be very, very hard to justify things like Iraq or Afghanistan now, because there just hasn't been very much to show for it. If Iraq and Afghanistan were vibrant democracies now, there would be, but they aren't. So,
well, just to push back from my own perspective now, couldn't you say that I'm actually completely in agreement on the Afghanistan issue? I think we should have gotten in and out as soon as possible, but
as soon as Bin Laden was dead.
Right. Well, I think we should have gotten in and out much sooner than that, but I guess Osama's death would have been a perfect reason to withdraw. But I think that our withdrawal from Iraq created the vacuum that led to the rise of ISIS. And if we had withdrawn from Afghanistan and stayed in Iraq instead, since Iraq, at least from my perspective, seemed to be shaping into a much more functioning democracy, don't you think that would not have been foreign adventurism, but actually would have been establishing a place for democracy?
Iraq had worked out, then it wouldn't have been adventurism. It would have been an American foreign policy success. And maybe if we'd done that, it would have been. It never ended up worth it, but that didn't end up happening. So, and it's impossible.
Right, but I would argue that was Obama's incompetence rather than necessarily Bush's failure.
Right.
Well, and you draw a critical distinction there too when you say that if the policies had worked, if the prosecution of our military endeavors had worked out, that then it would have been American policy interest, but because they didn't work out, it's adventurism. So to me, it seems like intent is also important. I might be missing something here.
Well, intent that we can be sure will actually work. We didn't notice it in 2003. We thought it was going to work in 2003, and it didn't, and we spent a lot of money and lives that ended up not going to any good purpose. I did say all this with the intention of ending it with a but. So, because I'm about to refute everything I just said about Iraq and Afghanistan, at least partially. This time, it really is different. And that's where I was going with this, actually. Because, the thing is that, Iraq and Afghanistan were, very small, minor countries in the middle of the Middle East. And ultimately, if you could have argued fairly well that America would have been fine had they not intervened had there not been any intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. Maybe it would have been passing up an opportunity, but ultimately it wouldn't have been catastrophic if America had intervened there. But the thing is, neo-Cold War of China is actually an existential problem, because if someone is going to come up out on top, it will be either America or China, and then they'll have more or less a free hand to say that these are going to be the values that the rest of the world is going to follow by. So what I'm arguing here really is that unlike Iraq, unlike Afghanistan, China is an existential issue comparable to the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany during World War II or the Cold War. So in this case, it really is different. And for this reason, and that's why it matters that the U.S. takes up the China challenge, whereas it would not have been existential for Iraq or Afghanistan. So that's where I'm going with the whole Leviathan thing. This time it's different. We didn't need the Leviathan. Maybe shouldn't have existed to prosecute Iraq or Afghanistan, but it needs to exist now to prosecute China. And so this is something that, of course, people who aren't really on board with this whole the big state should exist in order to fight this outside existential threat. necessarily get on board with. Like a lot of people are going to be thinking, well, gee, if it was hard to build a democracy in Iraq, why are we going to try to do this in China? Why are we even just going to pen up China in China and keep them from influencing other countries? Does it matter to the American people, to the average American, if China is is invading Taiwan or trying to influence Germany or building all these new mines and factories in Africa to get their hands on their natural resources and stuff? Why is all this stuff relevant to American interests? And so the answer to that question is that, unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, this time it matters because losing the field of losing Africa, losing parts of Europe, losing places like Taiwan would be actually catastrophic to American interests. Because if America lost Iraq, then that would be a blow to American prestige, and it would prove that there was some corner of the earth where America's writ didn't reach. That's not the case with China. It would actually lead to America being shunted down to second place and American values being shunted down to second place. So it matters more this time.
Winston,
and
there are a lot of people. I'm sorry, go ahead, Ian.
There's two specific areas that I want to highlight that I have been aware of for a couple months that China is making serious strides in, and America is not. One of those is monetary policy. The American dollar is extremely weak for stupid reasons. So during the Bush years, President George W. Bush deliberately kept the dollar weak so that we'd have a good trade relationship with a lot of people, so that wasn't too dominant. Now the dollar is weak because of our massive inflation problem, and China has made serious attempts to buy up hard currency, gold and other precious metals, to back the yuan in what most people probably think is an attempt to displace the dollar as the world currency standard.
That's
there's also a nuclear problem in that a lot of countries in the developing world are attempting to become nuclearized, whether for military or for simple power generation, because the US still is unable to support nuclear, even though it would be environmentally and economically to our advantage, both in our territories and in the world. China is assisting with infrastructure and expertise developing countries to nuclearize their power grids. If we were doing that, we would be enhancing our ties. We would be making the environment better, which is something the ridiculous Paris Accord is supposed to be doing, but instead we're focusing on everything that doesn't help the environment. But we're on both monetary policy and on nuclear power generation. We are falling behind, and China is stepping up to fill that place. And this is not foreign adventurism. This is stuff that we could do as a trade and economic partner and an ally to these countries. And I think it is shameful that the U.S. is not doing this.
You strike a really great point. Sorry, Christine.
I actually had a question on that, and that is, you said that we're in the danger of losing U.S. dominance in values and in currency. Now, to the people who are listening to this who haven't maybe thought about it, what is that going to mean for the daily life of Americans?
So both of your questions are actually interrelated with each other, and I'd say are best answered together. So you notice that when I've talked about how the rise of China, it's not good for America because America will lose their predominance, and some people would think it would suck to not be number one, but how bad could it possibly be being number two? Number two is still number two out of 190 different countries. Is that going to be even really terrible? And a lot of people are going to dovetail with what Ian said, are going to be thinking, so why is it America's business to be building nuclear power plants in Angola or India or wherever? Or why do they have to be we have to be spending American taxpayer dollars doing this stuff? For that matter, or is it really such a bad thing if the U.S. current dollar isn't the worst reserve currency? Why does it matter if a lot of people who maybe some of the people who listen to our podcast are going to be thinking, well, that's something that the Fed does. I don't really like the Fed. Why do we have this activist monetary policy in the first place? Just leave it to the markets. So that's going to be a big criticism that I'm going to anticipate is going to be coming to both these ends, because the things that you described, Ian, are examples of the kind of big government that most conservatives aren't really a fan of. So people are going to be even asking, so why do we do this in the first place? And And if we're not, and if why do we want to be number one in the first place? And to be honest, the answer to that is why we want to be number one is because that enables us to do those things. For example, we say we're the ones who are going to be telling you how to build nuclear and what you can't do with your nuclear. And we're the ones whose currency is the reserve currency that everybody does their contracts in. So that's the reason why we want to be number one. But I haven't really answered why we want to be number one. And the reason for it is because we exist in a world where America is the biggest player, but not the majority player. Where America, the population is something like 1/20th of the whole, I believe, and America's GDP is 1/5 the whole. So that makes America the most important player, but they're not the dominant player. That means that when America speaks, people follow usually, but not always. And but that also means that, but because the best player is still only about 1/5 the whole, that means that the globally dominant player is never going to be someone who just happens to have all the power. It's someone who assembled a coalition of different powers and then brought it all together, and then used that to spread their values to the rest of the world. That's, of course, what America's been doing since 1945, spreading the values of liberalism, democracy, freedom to the rest of the world. And so by doing this, America has made more of the world like America and ensured, more importantly, that none of these other powers who might not have been open to democracy and freedom and stuff beforehand aren't going to join some kind of coalition that's going to be actually, we think these values are better. We're going to impose them on you. And for most of the Cold War, this was communism. And in China's case, this is generic brand authoritarianism. We believe that this democracy thing is really stupid, and we're going to evangelize dictatorship instead. We don't want people who support communism or dictatorship to get to 51% of the world, because then that would put them in the leading position, and then they would be able to say, hey, all right, all of these smart people are going to adopt dictatorship, because now that we have that much of the world, our values are default, and people are going to gradually move away from that. And it would be really tempting to say, but does that really matter for America? So what if Germany goes dictatorships? What if Angola or India goes that way? America, even with only 25% of the world's GDP and 1/20th of the world's population and a huge barrel of nukes, can always say, all of you people can do whatever you want. We're just going to keep doing our own thing, which is the freedom and democracy thing in America. But in the end, it doesn't work like that. If all the other countries went the way of communism or dictatorship, they would have 80% of the world's power, and at that point, America would have just become a pariah state. It would be very hard to defend the system of freedom and democracy, because everybody else has already gotten away, and it would be hard even for America to contest with the other 80%, with only 20% of the global GDP America has. And that's why it's not something it's not a good idea for America to just say, all of you people do whatever you want. We're just going to stay here, play in our own sandbox, and hope you don't come in and try to.
Let's talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about stuff that might have hit the news recently. There have been a lot of accusations from both political parties for the last two presidential election cycles that Russia and China influenced who won the presidential election in a significant way.
I'm not going to take a comment on that specifically, but it is another good point you bring up, that just the fact that we can protect ourselves physically doesn't mean that we're going to protect ourselves ideologically, because these ideas can still reach in, and they're more convincing if they're backed by more power. And in fact, China has been able to. For example, you may have heard about the Houston rockets, or say even some of the censorship of China critics on social media. So just because we can defend ourselves physically doesn't mean we can defend ourselves ideologically. And imagine how much more influential China would be if she could muster 80% of the world's GDP instead of just the 15% she has right now to force people to get in line.
So, Winston, let's clarify for our listeners what happened with the Houston rockets.
Yes. So right about when the Hong Kong protests were taking place, in 2019, there was an incident where Daryl Morey, that's his name, and the manager for the Houston Rockets, posted a tweet in support of Hong Kong. And then in China, where the NBA has a very big fan base, he sent a message to the Houston Rockets saying, get rid of this guy or you won't be really sorry. So they got rid of Daryl Morey, and there was a huge shitstorm about it on social media. And then the Houston Rockets got banned from China anyhow, just instead because you've got to kick someone when they're down or something like that. And just I want to show that even if you've just completely abandoned the notion that we only need to protect ourselves from China, we don't need to care about what the rest of the world does. Well, this is just transparently not true, because so long as China is very powerful and committed to authoritarianism, those two together, or then she can also still reach into America and then say, yeah, you have to do this. And you don't even need to be that powerful in order to do that. You just 15% is apparently more than enough. You don't really want China to get to other 65% that is not U.S. or China aligned, and or just up for grabs.
Well, to go back to what we were saying, the U.S. has a long history, and this is not something I, as an American, am particularly proud of, but we have a long history of strong-arming countries that we would consider rogue. So, famous examples are things like Iran-Contra and various attempts to oust the Castros, and a lot of influence in both Africa and South America's governmental turnovers. I think we probably also have something to do with a lot of the Southeast Asian state turnovers. And that's what happens when you are close to the bottom of the totem pole. People who have power will come in and meddle with you, whether it's by hacking or propaganda or spending a lot of money through various shell corporations and donors. Right now, America is big and powerful enough that we can shrug off those attacks. Those attacks happen.
Not completely, as you could tell from the whole Houston Rockets thing.
I do not deny that Russia and China both spent some effort to influence both of the last presidential elections, but I think that neither of them were significant because we are big and strong enough that it didn't matter.
Yeah.
If we dropped to number 2, it would start to matter a whole lot more. And I think that this idea that we can just let the world take care of itself is naive. Power is a vacuum. If you don't have someone holding the power, someone else
will take it for you.
Yeah, and China will do it. We know that.
Ian, it's notable especially that the world wars were greatly prefaced by huge amounts of isolationism.
Exactly. I think that's it completely right, because America, even before World War II, was the elephant in the room. More industry than any other country on the planet, but without America filling the void, mostly because America renounced it themselves. All of a sudden, the other powers were able to fill the void, and this tragically turned out to be Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, who had less than benevolent designs on everyone else.
And again, I'm trying to show that I don't have illusions about U.S. foreign policy or our domestic policy. It's not that even though I believe we have the best system that so far has been seen in history, that we make no mistakes, that our mistakes are sometimes even ill-motivated. I mean, you just have to look at what FDR did turning away Jewish refugees during World War II, or
locking up Japanese people in camps.
The Japanese, his own citizens. So the U.S. is no paragon. But I think if you look at what the U.S. has done and does compared to what China has done and does, yes, the U.S. has slavery. China has, within living memory, the Great Leap Forward, which cost 50 million of its own citizens their lives. It still
can get worse. It can always get worse.
Yeah.
And they still have concentration camps and forced labor.
Well, I don't know.
Literal slavery.
I think they're
people actually picking cotton as slaves. There's some kind of historical irony there. If you want to,
I was trying to use the most politic term.
Problem that China is suppressing brutally and unethically in the extreme.
It's a tragic thing because there's over 1 billion people there who are being oppressed in some form. Some more than others. Some get camps, and some others just get a divot silence from being able to talk out. But even if in the absence of is this bad for America or not, this was also a huge moral crime against over 1 billion people, which in itself is something that we should regard as being absolutely abominable.
And China has, in my lifetime, participated in aiding the violent overthrow of peaceful governments and helping people wind up in terrible, terrible conditions in their own countries. I'm thinking here, especially of Cambodia. You know, I'm old enough to know this is not ancient history.
Oh yeah, I actually was reading an article just recently about how back in the 90s, so this is right after the Khmer Rouge, which had the odd feature of having been backed by both China and the U.S. for reasons that made sense at the time. Because Nixon thought it could be a proxy against Vietnam. It was a weird time. Because he was also the president who went to China in the first place. Is for historical tidbit. And it's like between the 90s, they just have genocided a quarter of their population for unknown reasons. So the UN went in, tried to fix things, and failed miserably. People thought they were going to become a democracy. Right now, their dictatorship is one of the most brutal in Southeast Asia. It didn't work. The UN turned out to not be exactly equal to the task.
The UN's not equal to a lot of tasks.
Yeah, you
as
guys are right.
Conservatives, we generally think the UN is equal.
You know, and that's the thing. So they accuse the United States of meddling and going in at their own, but the motives of some international bodies can be highly suspect as well, because they are far more egalitarian in their representation than basically our economic and military might make us in the overall world action. And I think that the influence of the United States in the UN could go a long way toward pointing us towards some of the dangers we would have if you just listen to the way that they talk about us.
Yeah, it's something I think Americans don't realize because...
Speaking of the United Nations, I think that we need to remember that China is now on the Human Rights Council of the United Nations.
It says a lot, doesn't it?
And they have spent their times, and this was very recent, I think last couple of years that they were appointed to the Human Rights Council. They've spent that time trying to argue that our civil rights struggles with George Floyd last year and the police brutality indicates that the U.S. is actually the primary violator of human rights in the world, when they have literal concentration camps in their own country focused on a racial and religious minority.
And a lot of people believe that. They really believe it. And a lot of American isolationists are actually repeating these same lines, which just astounds me.
It's like stuff like, how can you possibly be concerned about other countries' human rights when you have things like these kind of police protests? I mean, but none of these people end up in camps. It's like not in the same, spectrum, even the same order of magnitude. But one thing I wanted to get to is that, so we seem to have spent about half our time so far. So one thing which I did want to get to try to point home with is, not only is the U.S. by far not the worst human rights violator in the world, not even close to it, and not only are the people who are in second place and trying to get to first probably much worse and going to inflict the same horror show on everybody else. So what does that have to do with the whole Leviathan thing I didn't talk about earlier? So, what do we expect you as citizens and taxpayers and is to be doing about it? So, and that's where I got to where the genesis of the whole Leviathan conversation in the first place is because one thing you could do is that you could go on podcasts and then talk about how terrible and awful these things are, and then sign off and then continue about your day. But another thing that would be but a lot of what we've been discussing has been talked about in terms of, for example, the war against Nazi Germany during World War II or the Cold War against the Soviet Union. It implicitly suggests that we should be doing some kind of big statement, doing these big state actions in order to try to prevent and to prevent this horrible scenario from taking place. And implicit to this, even though, and it just takes the vein of stuff like, the government should be doing X about this. It should be, say, banning the import of goods that were made by slaves. It should be doing a big military buildup to make sure that China doesn't annex their neighbors or something, in which they are planning to do, as they keep talking about Taiwan. So what do we want to do about this? Well, we should build up the military in order to defend against them and to prevent Taiwan from being invaded. That's a pretty easy sell, and I'd say a lot of people listening to this chat and even a lot of isolationists would say this is the easiest sell, because because the military is a popular institution, including on the right, and even as a result, it is not such a hard sell to say we should have more ships, more tanks, more bombers in order to deter the PLA from crossing the Taiwan Straits and invading Taiwan. But still, what's the harder sell is that countering is that struggling for influence in the globe and preventing the horror show that we described in the first half of this podcast from taking place is probably not going to involve, mostly not going to involve tanks and ships and bombers. It's because let's think about like the bad things we want to prevent. We want to prevent espionage. We want to prevent the Chinese government from forcing U.S. companies to fire people for expressing support for democracy. We want to prevent industry from being taken away from America and sent to China. And those are all things that are like that are not being that can't be prevented with ships or tanks or bombers. They have to be prevented using other actions. We need our own spies to figure out who the spies here are. We need some intelligent industrial policy to ensure that the industry stays here and not overseas. We need to go back to the examples that Ian brought up not too long ago. That we need to make sure that the people who are building nuclear power plants in these other countries are Americans and not Chinese, so that we can ensure that they're not being put to some malign purpose. We need to make sure that telecom networks globally are being made by friendly countries and not by hostile countries. And all this is stuff that's suggests that we're going to be even creating these bigger and bigger roles for governments. So we have a pretty good illustration of what I've described earlier was that recently I saw on Twitter, actually, basically there was a publication of a little over 200 actions taken by the Trump administration just in last year alone to prevent these kinds of things from happening. They want to do things like prevent them and to have the Chinese banks from buying up American industry and shipping it overseas. They want to ensure that investment in other countries it belongs to America and not China, so that the benefits accrue to America. They want to ensure that whenever China does do bad things, sanctions are put in response so that China can't benefit from these. They want to ban the slave-made goods from being sold in America. And so I looked at the list, and of those the 220 actions that he described in that's having been done, 22 were actually done by, not 22, I think it's actually 24, yes, that were done by the Department of Defense. That's only 10% of it. And that speaks to what I'm getting at here, is that this is, as the Trump administration was want to describe it, an all-of-government effort. We need all these different agencies to do it because there are some things that can't be done by simply weapons or the military. We have to, and that includes stuff like encouraging the industry to develop here and protecting us from foreign influence or keeping out slave-made goods. So, and this brings us back to Leviathan, because the role of Leviathan, because when we do all these things, we're creating our own Leviathan that in order to protect the freedoms we have now, but we're giving all these powers over to government in order to ensure that safety, that freedom and the democracy and safety can continue to flourish in America. So that's a big trade-off we're having. So when we say, so when the government says you can't buy these goods which were made by slaves in China, well, that's giving the government the power to say you can't buy X product, and it's for a good reason, a very good reason, but it's still a precedent that you're giving the government, and you really hope it's not going to be turned internally at some point. And when the government says you can't have access to TikTok in America anymore because it's being used as a tool of foreign influence, well, that's all true, and it probably is right in the present. But at the same time, we want to make sure this doesn't get say turned to apps domestically that just happen to have fallen out of favor of the government. Well, actually, it's a bit.
Oh, you mean like Parler?
Yeah,
frankly?
Actually, that's what I was getting at. It's like, so
I will say it boldly because that's very disturbing. That, and there's calls. I was watching a podcast of Sam Harris actually with General McChrystal. Or I listened to it, and they were actually arguing that conservatives needed to be stopped from talking to each other at all.
And that's
because the danger presented by conservatives to the American government was so high that if they talked to each other, then they would further radicalize. And they actually compared us to Al Qaeda.
Does anybody ever remember when Sam Harris was supposed to be like some kind of paragon of free thinking? Like good times, right? When was that?
It wasn't that long ago. Like 2 months.
As people from the Christian demographic, even if we're not necessarily all still Christian, I think we all know that Sam Harris is a reactive thinker rather than necessarily a free thinker.
And that's what I'm getting at, because sure, this was technically done by the private sector, and therefore it's not the business of government or wherever. But once you establish the precedent that it's okay to ban an app, then this was a much easier sell. Because we banned TikTok because it's being made by bad people and being used to do bad things. But now people are using marginally the same arguments against Parler. Does that mean that we shouldn't have banned TikTok, or does it mean that we should have, and this is what I actually think, we should have made it of a much clearer definition and ensured that the tools that could be used to ban TikTok couldn't be then turned internally and then used to ban Parler? Because it's not a good argument that you shouldn't have banned TikTok because then there would have been ground to stand on to ban Parler, because firstly it would have happened anyhow, and secondly because that is not mean that TikTok was a good thing. It was probably going to be used for all kinds of bad things. And so that's what I'm getting at, is that so we created all this power and then we accumulated it for the purpose of protection that we agreed had to be done because it was an urgent cause, as we discussed earlier. But at the same time, it's in a defense.
Sorry. How would you know if private corporations aren't working as agents of the government anyway?
Honestly, they probably were in this case.
Coercion. Because, for example, Congress has hauled Facebook up several times to testify over.
Why aren't you taking on hate speech? If you don't take on hate speech, will break you up. I mean, in that position,
exactly.
What do you do?
And that is coercion. That is the use of coercive power by the government. And so that not only makes, or possibly not even nominally, quite significantly makes Facebook into an agent of the state for its very existence. And so the argument that it's private corporations taking away rights, especially when they're so important as things like the freedom to communicate, then you really start wondering, how are they acting as an independent entity versus a government agent?
I agree completely. I think it's because this is one of the other things I was getting at in Leviathan. And the distinction between private and public is very often not a very useful distinction, because as the government is perfectly capable of using private agents as its proxies, as I suspect might have actually happened in the case of Parler. So if I had to guess, I think there was probably a very significant possibility that the Biden administration the incoming administration let it quietly be known that if AWS and Facebook didn't get a handle on just an app that many of them disliked, Parler, there would be how to pay, and as a result, in order to avert the immediate how to pay, they got some lesser how to pay from the conservatives. If so, maybe that's what went down. Maybe that's what wasn't what went down, but it seems pretty plausible in my mind. And so this straight out the central issue of what I'm talking about, because so we talk about all these this big horror show we're trying to prevent, and how we had to give the state a lot of power to do this. But the central question is, how do we prevent this power from being turned internally? And in fact, there's another even blunter example we could use here. So again, without commenting on the justification of this or not, recently, after the Capitol riots, there was the government moved 25,000 soldiers into D.C. and then established a totally ironically named green zone in the middle of Washington, D.C. and said, yeah, it's this is absolutely not like Baghdad or Kabul at all. We're just going to put in a lot of troops, and then we're going to establish a safe zone that we're going to use the same term that we used to describe the place in Iraq. The same term that we used to describe that place in Iraq, and then say, and we will make sure that things occur peacefully here. Now, regardless of whether you think that Biden, whether this was justified or not, the irony is pretty clear, because this was stuff that the U.S. was doing overseas in Iraq. It suddenly boomeranged and then went back to the homeland. And what happened in Baghdad now happens in D.C. Then Leviathan turns in and starts eating its tail.
And McChrystal on that podcast actually said we may need to put up concrete barriers in neighborhoods to prevent conservatives from murdering their neighbors just because they're so crazy. It was astounding.
Jesus, can you hear this? Can you hear himself talk?
No, that's what my reaction was.
In Afghanistan,
because conservatives, despite the Capitol riots, have definitely been the ones who have been noticed murdering and rioting and committing property damage over the last 8 months.
Yeah, so but remember, words are violence. Violence isn't violence. Burning things down, property damage isn't violence, but words are.
How many people were killed by words in Chaz? Well, we are out of time, but we clearly have a lot more to talk about. So I'm going to have Winston back again soon.
Well, before we sign off for a moment, because we brought Otis up now, I just want to make a question more explicit. So in the immediate, we know that too, because we want to keep China from becoming the dominant power on the globe and then using that to impose their system and everyone else. We're building up this big massive state now that's 90% of the actions are not going to be military related. It's going to be stuff like sanctions. It's going to be stuff like foreign investment. And there will be a military aspect, but it won't be the dominant aspect. We're building up all of this infrastructure, which, for lack of a better term, is to constrain China from being able to engage in malicious action abroad, and hopefully will eventually roll back the CCP within China itself and put an end to this problem permanently by ensuring that the CCP's dominance no longer is a thing either in China or outside China. But these are all coercive actions that we believe, that we're convinced are going to be necessary in the next few minutes. I mean, not few minutes, few decades. Freudian slip, because I know we're going to be signing off in a few minutes, but also in the next few minutes. So we're going to create this massive coercive infrastructure in order to ensure the long-term security of American security. So, but the big question we really should be asking is can we, once we've finished ensuring that the CCP is no longer a threat to global freedom and human rights, it's how are we going to ensure that the massive infrastructure we put in place to ensure this doesn't get turned internally within a moon's turn or a decade's turn or wherever people might decide, you know what, these Republicans are actually just as bad as the CCP. Now let's turn this massive infrastructure we created for coercion internally against these people who are engaging in wrongthink. And that's a question that I want all of you who've been listening to this to be chewing on, because in this podcast, we just developed two seemingly contradictory theses. Firstly, that we need a big Leviathan in order to protect us from malign foreign actors, but we also need to protect ourselves from this Leviathan. And the thing I want you leaving this podcast to take away from this is, how are we going to balance all this? How are we going to ensure that Leviathan will protect us from the other Leviathans overseas, but not be turned internally in order to gobble us up in the end? And there's so many answers here. Like, my own answer is going to be, we need this Leviathan now, and we really need it yesterday. So for a moment, we have to build it up in order to defend against the immediate threat. And then we'll cross the bridge of how we prevent it from gobbling us up internally later. But I want you all to think about this, to chew on it, to be able to, so that we can approach this contradiction, this paradox, intelligently.
Well, I think that that's a really good thought to leave us on. And my own contribution to that is a lot of what prevents the Leviathan from becoming normalized in our own governmental domestic actions will be the consent of the governed. Right now, there's this attitude of learned helplessness in American life, the victim mentality on the left and the right. And I would say that, yes, we are more afraid that the government will say, oh, the Republicans are a problem. But I would be just as opposed to state actions being taken to jail normal Democrats or normal Democrat politicians. So I think that the way we can work now, even as we are trying to spool up a Leviathan apparatus to fight the CCP, is to maintain the reason we're fighting it is because we believe in freedom. We believe that we need some coercive power that is available for radical actions, but it's in the service of preserving freedom for people like the Hong Kongers or the Uyghurs or all of China's neighbors. If we become the same as the CCP in the way we treat our own people,
then we haven't fought this we did all this for nothing.
Yeah. An American Communist Party, whether it's called the American Republic of Freedom or not, is no better than the Chinese Communist Party. So, thank you, Winston, for joining us. We're definitely going to have you on again, because I definitely want to get your thoughts on academia and productivity. We've got a really good essay that I want you to elucidate on productivity in the next couple of months. So thank you for joining us, Christine and Winston.
Yep, glad to be here.
I will see you guys next week. And I think we are going to keep
to
our
see you
podcast
both.
on Sunday, though hopefully not quite as late.
Yep.
Yeah,
good to see you
we'll
both.
try to make
All
it
right.
a little bit earlier.
Yeah, 9:30, 10:30
All right,
EST is
guys.
it's pretty late.
All right. Have a
Okay.
great night. Have a
Yep,
great
you
week.
as well.
And we see everyone who watches next week. Thank you for watching.
Bye.